Hello everybody, I'm Eternal Flame here, and today I'm here to do a video that's basically about how I would plan to take out Sukuna within the month-long time skip and the tools we have access to fully on the table. And this video is inspired by Broken Ronin's video, so huge shout out to him for giving me this entire idea for a video. However, I am going to approach this video a bit different than how he did it, which you're going to understand when I actually get into the explanation for how this is going to work and basically rules I'm going to have to fall under and follow with this respective video. However, if you guys do like this type of content in specific, where I actually do alter the plans of characters in order to try and make a much more optimal plan, or at least what I think is more optimal, then be sure to comment that down in the comment section down below, as well as like the video, because the more likes this type of video gets, the more likely this type of video will be to come. I also want to see what you guys' opinion are on my specific plans that I'm going to come up with in this video. Anyways, let's get into this now. Now, up first, I'm going to talk about the three parts of this video that I'm going to split this part into, which number one is how I would alter their preparation, because we actually have found out some details on how they prepared for this respective battle, more specifically how they managed to cheat in order to become so strong thanks to us finding out Ui Ui's curse technique and getting a full description on it. You know what, I'm not calling him Ui Ui for the rest of this video because I do not like this name. Shout out to Alonzi, we're calling him Brian. So basically I'm going to talk about how I would plan out the preparations for this specific battle. Because while we do know Brian has a total of 2 soul swaps per person, and he did soul swap people, I'm going to talk about how I soul swap the people, and for all I know, they might have actually ended up doing it the same way that I'm about to talk about how I do it. The second part of this video is going to be about strategies for the respective 2 battles, where the battles that we're going to be planning out for is the battle against Kenjaku as well as the battle against Sukuna, because we're going to have to make alterations for both of them in order to make some optimal strategy. And the final part of this video is going to be about how we might be able to alter the Gojo versus Sukuna fight if we can alter it at all. This will also be split up into several chapters, so you can go to whichever part you want to go to. Finally, there are also going to be 2 specific rules that I am placing onto myself as well, where the first rule is we can't use knowledge that we find out in hindsight. For example, we are not going to be able to use the fact that we find out in the manga that Kamutoke is the one that gets taken away from Higuruma's domain, so we're not going to know that. That's one of the things that we're not going to be able to use. So any knowledge that we get from hindsight is not going to be allowed whatsoever. The second thing is we can't make characters act wildly out of character. For example, we cannot make the characters actually go for killing Sukuna rather than saving Megumi. If you want to know how the characters had several opportunities to kill Megumi as well as Sukuna in this fight, then go check out this other video about is Megumi worth saving, but we are still going to be going into this video with the entire goal of saving Megumi alongside taking out Sukuna. So now, without further ado, let's begin the preparation phase for this video and how I would alter the preparation phase. Now, one of the biggest issues that I have with the entire preparation phase is the massive lack of communication among the characters. Now, I do think there are some massive misconceptions for some lack of communications, which is specifically around the Gojo versus Sukuna fight, which I'm going to talk about that one later into the video. However, there are some other massive actual miscommunications that they just straight up didn't have, or lack of communication. For example, no one had any idea about Miguel or LaRue, which is something they should have most definitely known about. Also, I'm putting this in the preparation phase as well, just to mention it now. Hakari stay in Jackpot the entire time. The fact that Hakari had to actually open up his domain and not start out in Jackpot is something that I kind of find ridiculous, considering they're fighting against Sukuna. Hakari has a method of also staying in Jackpot the entire time, which is just constantly activating his domain and using Miwa as a domain dump, or someone else, or using Momo as a domain dump. Not like Momo's doing anything on the battlefield. Yeah, we don't need Momo. Though it is also a funny image in my head now that all of the characters have to listen to a love song in the background while Sukuna and Gojo are fighting for their lives, but yeah, that's going to be like one of the first 2 preparations we're doing. Up next is how we're going to use Brian's soul swap technique, which Brian's soul swap technique is very, very important to understand on how it functions. After all, by understanding how it functions, we're going to be able to exploit it as best as we can in order for it to have the optimal best results. Now, from a lot of people that I've talked to, I've seen them thinking about who would be the best 2 people for everybody to swap with, and in my opinion, they're looking at it completely wrong. After all, he specifically said he's able to swap everybody 2 times or 2 per person in order for them to be able to gain the skills within someone else's body. And it's very heavily implied by entering into someone's body, they're able to near immediately pick up on the skills after training for a little bit within that person's body by him. The reason why I believe doing things in the right order is because it needs to be remembered everyone has a total of 2 soul swaps per person, which means you're actually probably able to use this to your advantage in a specific way if you do it in the right order. Now, to explain why the right order matters, I'm actually going to use it as an example in order to explain it, by first having Shoko soul swap with Hakari. This is going to give Hakari active knowledge on how to RCT even without using Jackpot. Then after, you have Hikari Soul Swap with Yuta. This is going to give access to Yuta both the RCT knowledge that Hikari has as well as Shoko has, because Hikari's soul has already picked up the knowledge on how to heal through Shoko, and that's already been adapted to his own body. Thus, by extension, you give Yuta access to the ability on how to shift domain coordinates while also giving him Shoko's level of RCT knowledge and healing. Then after, you have Yuta Soul Swap with Kusakabe in order to gain Kusakabe's level of simple domain skill, while giving Kusakabe access to all of the RCT that had been stored up inside of his brain. Then you soul swap Kusakabe with Choso, giving Choso access to the simple domain knowledge while also giving him access to all of the RCT ability, basically stacking 4 people's knowledge into one separate brain in order for them to soul swap with, because the body has already picked up on those 4 skills, technically still only using 2 soul swaps per person. And then finally you have Yuji soul swap with Choso, giving him access to all of that stacked knowledge plus Choso's mastery of blood manipulation all in one body. And like that, you give Yuji the benefits of soul swapping with 5 separate people, even though he only soul swapped with 1 person and still has an extra soul swappy left. This should very well be possible because it still falls in the limits of his technique of soul swapping with 2 per person, and everyone other than Yuji has only used 2 soul swaps so far, and Yuji still has 1 left. This also could potentially give both Choso and Yuji the foundation on how to create a domain expansion as well, which might end up being useful in the future or might not. It could be very possible they don't end up awakening a domain. We don't know that yet, but it could still be possible that they do end up awakening the domain through having the foundations of both Hikari and Yuta. You could also use Yuji's last soul swap in order to soul swap Higuruma and Yuji, thus giving Higuruma access to the RCT skill that he needs that he doesn't end up awakening until Sukuna literally bullies it out of him. So in my opinion, that's how you optimize it best, but at the same time, it could be possible that I do have a misunderstanding of the soul swap technique, and I'm going to admit that it could be possible that that is the case. So through this, though, we have both Yuji having full access to the skill of blood manipulation that Choso has access to. Both Choso and Yuji have access to simple domain from Kusakabe. All 3 of them have access to massive RCT skills as well as domain skills, or at least the potential to awaken a barrier. Now, I don't think they'd end up awakening a domain inside of the 1-month time skip, but they now have access to the foundations for awakening a domain, which isn't going to be important for Kusakabe, but it will be important for Yuji and Choso because now they do have the potential to be pushed to awakening a domains themselves. This mainly just helps Yuji because I don't actually think that Yuji soul swapped with Choso in canon, considering Yuji's lack of skill with convergence. Yuji in canon is confirmed to have soul swapped with Kusakabe, but I think the other person he soul swapped with is one of the healers. Mainly because I don't think they went through as complex as a method that I just went through in that entire soul swap method. But now we're going to move on to the next type of a preparation we're going to be doing, and people who are fans of the Full Potential series, you know exactly where I'm about to be going with this. Binding Vows. Now, in my opinion, the fact they're not using binding vows, or at least they're not using binding vows that we currently know of, is ridiculous in my opinion. They're fighting against Sukuna, the strongest in history, as well as Urame, an ice smurf, and Kenjaku, the oldest sorcerer that we currently know about. The fact they're not using it is ridiculous. Now, yes, I know there's a meta-narrative reason of Sukuna is the peak of Jujutsu, and he exploits everything he finds because that's how Sukuna is. Meanwhile, the cast themselves are only going to use whatever is available to them and not use binding vows, or there's some other meta-narrative reason, like the contrast between Sukuna being someone so enveloped with Jujutsu that he's going to use everything it has access to, that kind of good jazz. I don't care. The fact they're not using binding vows at all is really, really stupid, especially considering they're battling against Sukuna. Especially considering self-imposed binding vows are so easy to exploit. Remember how Hikari survived Kashimo's explosion? It was by sacrificing his arm. Oh, wait, that arm regrew back. So yeah, no, self-imposed binding vows are extremely easy to exploit. Now, I get we're probably not going to be able to convince Gojo and Kashimo to use binding vows because both of them kind of want to die. Gojo wants to show his full power and basically teach Sukuna about love, that entire good jazz. Kashimo wants to die. Those two using binding vows doesn't make sense. However, everyone else, especially Yuji and Yuta, Yuji is someone who literally said, I will eat anything so long as that means I can kill him, and Yuta being someone who doesn't care about fighting in strength at all, doesn't use binding vows at all during this time span, just kind of surprises me. Especially considering they are all aware of how strong Sukuna is, and these binding vows, these small potential amps they could do for small sacrifices, could literally mean life or death for them with the longer this battle continues. Especially considering Yuji's ability to nerf Sukuna with his soul punches, these small amps would help them very, very heavily. Now you might be wondering, what binding vow would I make? The first binding vow that I have in mind for the entire cast to make is basically a similar one to how Nanami made his binding vow. where Nanami made a binding vow that only allowed him to use 90% of his curse energy throughout the day, and at nighttime when he was working overtime, he would gain access to 120% of his curse energy. Instead of that, we're basically going to have all of the cast have a few specific days where they just straight up can't use curse energy at all, or have a limited amount of curse energy to make it all add up so they can gain that curse energy back in their battle against Sukuna, basically giving them their own overtime type mode. This should offer a significant amp, mainly because of the fact that restriction is much heavier on themselves, and I really doubt that Kenjaku or Sukuna is going to act at that point, considering they kind of have been implied to just honor the entire agreement between the two of them, and that's not really going to be a risk, at least in my opinion, especially because Gojo is still going to be there too. Or, well, I know Sukuna wouldn't because Sukuna honored the deal, Kenjaku wouldn't because he's afraid of Gojo. Then there's just smaller binding vows for smaller sacrifices. Now, I don't exactly have smaller binding vows in mind for what they could actually do, but these smaller binding vows mainly existing not to affect the battle against Sukuna would end up stacking up eventually. Which, this is what I'm actually going to leave up to you guys to come up with smaller binding vows that the cast could make that wouldn't affect the battle too much. Mainly because I'm going to be real with you guys, I don't have that many ideas for smaller binding vows that they could potentially put in place in order to not affect them too much and actually give them massive benefits. However, we aren't quite done with our preparations yet. We're also going to have Mei get as many birds as possible, which shouldn't surprise anybody as to why, because having as many birds on the field as possible would be very, very useful, especially considering how powerful the birds have been implied to be through Bird Strike with just one of them alone. Now, the purpose of the birds will add up when we actually get into the strategy section of this battlefield, but for now, just know there are going to be a lot more birds than there actually originally was. Finally, for the final section of our preparation, we are also going to have Gojo just start teleporting all across the globe in order to find cursed objects in order to bring them to Yuji. Well, not just all across the globe, basically just most of Japan. The reason why is so we can have Yuji eat them. After all, Yuji is able to consume cursed objects and turn them into actual cursed energy for himself, and he has the full capability of suppressing Sukuna. So if we basically make Yuji a cursed conglomeration with a lot more cursed energy, this is going to significantly help our chances in winning the fight, especially considering how significant of a role Yuji is playing and ends up playing later into the fight. Anyway, that's the last part of our preparation phase, so now we're going to move on to how we would actually strategize around this fight and how we would change the fight in order to make sure the characters can win. Now, for those of you who skip past the preparation phase, I'm basically going to summarize the entire preparation phase for you now. All the characters should be significantly stronger through a binding vow we place on them in inspiration for Nanami. Yuji now has fully mastered blood manipulation through us exploiting Uiui's technique, and if you want to learn how we exploited it, go back and watch the preparation phase. Higuruma is starting out with RCT, and everyone communicated with each other so no one is going to be surprised by Miguel or LaRue. For this section of the video, we're basically going to look at how the fight against Sukuna has been going so far and try and alter the fight, or try and alter small parts of the fight in order to make the fight have better results for the characters. Now, I'm not going to come up with a completely new strategy, mainly because I don't really want this to enter into the territory of fan fiction. I just want to make small changes that might end up making it more and more possible for the characters themselves to win. Now up first, and this is going to be a very, very crucial part of the strategy, Yuta is not going for Kenjaku, Maki is going to handle going for Kenjaku. For anybody who doesn't know, Maki should have been capable of doing everything that Yuta was, even when Yuta's own statement that Yuta directly says Maki would have been able to handle that entire Curse Spirit outburst that Kenjaku ended up doing. There just would have been more civilian casualties as a result of that. However, just to substitute the fact that Rika won't be there, we're also going to send a bunch of Mei's crows in order to assist as well. Because Mei's crows have an incredible amount of range, so if she just activates Bird Strike, it should at least help to wipe out a few of them while Maki can handle the rest, and eventually catch back up to the group. Because Yuta being there is going to be very, very crucial for our plan to work. Now for this first scenario, a lot of the fight is going to go the exact same, where Gojo ends up tiring Sukuna as much as possible, then Kashimo fights him while Hikari ends up holding off Urame. Now the reason why I'm not going to send Choso after Urame instead, because I've seen a lot of people talking about that Choso should be the one fighting Urame and not Hikari. Here is the thing. The only reason that Choso did as well as he did against Urame back in Shibuya was because of the fact that he could catch Urame off guard with the poison. Now Urame is very aware of that, and that's not going to happen again. So we're sending Hikari to stall them, mainly because Urame being there is going to be way too much of a problem for all of us. Now the court trial also ends up going the same, where Yuji and Higuruma are the only two that are going to be sent out at first, and eventually Kamutoke is going to end up being taken away. However, instead of it just being the original group of Kusakabe, Ino, and Choso, in this timeline we're also going to have Yuta Akotsu appear as well. And immediately the second Yuta appears, he activates his domain expansion, which his domain is going to take in Yuji, Choso, a few of Mei's birds, as well as himself and Sukuna into the domain. Now this is all to put additional pressure onto Sukuna so Yuta can cycle through all of his cursed techniques, while Sukuna is being forced to keep up Hollow Wicker Basket. While it's happening, we're going to stack on as much damage onto Sukuna as possible, especially going for things like the hands in order to prevent Sukuna from casting the World Slash as much as possible, until Yuta eventually gets the specific curse technique that we've been searching for through all the cycles, which that curse technique that he's been searching for is Curse Speech. And the second that Yuta gets Curse Speech, he's going to tell Sukuna, don't move. And the second he does, he's also going to open up a little part of his domain for Higuruma to enter and stab Sukuna with the Executioner's Sword, thus instantly killing Sukuna, while at the same time freeing Megumi. Now, this should all be plausible purely because of the fact that in canon, we already know that Yuta Okkotsu was capable of telling Sukuna not to move, and it already working through his domain expansion, so this amplified Yuta should be capable of that. We also are aware of the fact that the Executioner Sword does specifically target the soul, so it's going to end up targeting Sukuna. The main reason that we know that is because back during the battle against Yuji, he took away Yuji's curse energy rather than Sukuna's curse technique, and they treated them as two separate beings rather than just one person. The reason why I'm saying that is because if it did treat them as one person, then Higuruma's domain would have taken away Sukuna's cleave and dismantle. It would not have taken away Yuji's curse energy, because we do know the order it goes in is curse technique, then cursed energy. So by extension, the Executioner's Sword should work here as well, so long as things are timed perfectly well, because Yuta should be capable of this, and this was the original plan anyways, just without Higuruma and instead with Maki and Kusakabe attacking. The only way I can see things going wrong is if it ends up with them getting caught off guard by the fact that Sukuna can do slashes without moving his arms, but at the same time, so long as we're able to weaken his output enough, it should actually end up working. Plus, all we need is a single stab and it is game over. Even if we can't get Yuta to go for Sukuna first instead of going for Kenjaku, we actually have a second way this could possibly be done. However, this way is admittedly much more risky than the first way, where instead we're going to have Inumaki enter onto the field. We're going to have Inumaki enter onto the field a little bit after the rest of the Sukuna execution squad arrives, but we're going to have Inumaki arrive onto the field, and he is going to sacrifice his voice through a binding vow in order to make sure Sukuna can't move. Where Inumaki is going to make a binding vow that will never allow him to speak or use cursed speech again, and make Sukuna not able to move for long enough for Higuruma to land the slash. Now, this one is significantly more risky than the Yuta one because we actually have confirmation that Yuta's don't move would work, while we don't have confirmation that Inumaki's would work, but I have faith that Inumaki and this binding vow would end up working. Plus, we know Inumaki is self-sacrificing and more than willing to do this too. A small price to pay for the death of Sukuna. Now, those are my two scenarios for how I can see them winning early on, which are very heavily around Higuruma and Cursed Speech, mainly because I don't actually see any other method for how they can end up winning early on. Like, maybe they might end up putting more pressure on Sukuna inside of Yuta's domain for Jacob's Ladder to fully work, but that's not fully likely as well, because it could just end up happening that Sukuna gets more serious faster in this timeline as well. So these are really the only two ways that I can actually see them winning this specific battle and winning it early, rather than whatever is going to happen in the manga. Whether this ends up being a win or a loss against Sukuna, we don't entirely know. But now I'm going to get into the final part of this video, which is going to be how I would alter Gojo in order to make sure Gojo actually ends up winning, or at least give Gojo the best chance to win. However, before I can even get into that, I have to get over a massive misconception the entire fanbase seems to have. Gojo went into the fight knowing Sukuna had an open barrier domain, or at least he would have been able to put the details together that he did have an open barrier domain, because Choso says that Inumaki and Yuji had described the details of the domain, and that Choso believed it was an open barrier domain. What they didn't know was Kenjaku had an open barrier domain. They knew very well that Sukuna had an open barrier domain, or well, it's more like they had the actual tools to be able to figure out that an open barrier domain. And for those of you saying, then why did Gojo fight Sukuna the same way he did? And I'm going to ask you a question in order to counter this. We as a fanbase had the knowledge that Sukuna had an open barrier domain for several years, and we had several people to throw opinions off of, like a literal entire fandom and much more details than the cast did. How many people did you see that talked about the potential of how Gojo could counter an open barrier domain, being that he ends up swapping the barrier conditions or just making his domain smaller? My simple answer is no one, because no one knew how they would interact, and neither did anyone in the cast know how Gojo and Sukuna's domains would interact until the moment it happened and Yuji remembered, like how we all remembered. I know there are some people who did definitely predict this, but I want to ask you, the people who did predict this, how many people actually predicted this in abundance? All that is basically to say I don't think I can alter the domain expansion battle between the two of them, even if I were to give Gojo even more knowledge. However, there is a much more simple way to alter the battle and just change the battle completely in order to make it so Gojo wins. At the end of the battle, when Sukuna only has one arm and he is basically missing an eye and he is very, very damaged, don't have Gojo make a speech. Have Gojo immediately go in for a gut punch, or one of the other characters just to teleport it in and immediately go for an attack to knock Sukuna out. Like, I don't know why all the characters were sitting there waiting. Gojo getting cocky and making a speech, that I get. But why are all the other characters just waiting? So long as Sukuna is still awake, the battle ain't over, and they gotta make sure the battle ends right then and there. That's the best situation where I can see them ending the fight, and then they end up removing Sukuna from Megumi's soul, using either Jacob's ladder or using Higuruma's domain. Then Gojo teleports over to Kenjaku, gives him a holo purple to the face, GG, no re, end of story, and we end up getting a good scenario. Now, of course, there is still the possibility of the culling games and having to deal with that, but that's for us to deal with later. So yeah, that's how I would alter the plans in order to make sure the good guys end up winning and winning much earlier, but I want to hear what you guys think in the comment section down below about the strategies and about the ways that they could end up winning. Anyways, that's about everything that I have to say here. I'm gonna see y'all later. Peace out.